About 15 years ago, I started wearing contacts. You can see how well that's working out for me. In fact, my grandfather used to wear a pair of glasses that looked just like these. And if you look closely enough, they're all smudged, just like his. Never took them off. But anyways, I digress. I used to wear, I started wearing contacts, and it was the most difficult thing to get started to do. I mean, there's a reason we have this reflex that causes us to blink our eyes when we try to touch them. Y'all understand that, right? And here we are, given this opportunity to open our eyes and stick in this piece of silicone or whatever they make it. It felt like steel to me. And, I look at Lisa and John, and they just, one finger here and like that, and this, I'm like, okay, this is a process. I'm stanced just like there. I got one hand over like this, and I'm lifting up this eyelid, and with this finger I'm lifting down this eyelid, because my eyes do what normally is supposed to happen. Like when you touch the eyeball, you blink, okay? And so I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm just easy, and then there's this sound of a suction when you've done it right. And it just, you know you got it right. Over the next few hours that I first put them in, they adjust. They turn, they settle, and I don't know if sometimes they're upside down or if they're inside out, you know that right away. But there's a specific way that they sit upon your eye, and things start to look more clear when you have your contacts in. But it was a struggle to get there, and a lot of days, I tell you, probably only twice a week do I wear contacts. It's so much easier just to put these things on and go on with your day. Over the next several weeks, what I'd like to do is just kind of unfold for you this series called Seeing Clearly. All the services and sermons are going to start with just a. Today is just a glimpse. And where I want to start is really at the beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, 2, and 3. Very familiar passage of Scripture. Anybody who has made the commitment to read through the Bible, whether they were successful or not, if you're going to read cover to cover, you usually start right here, and you usually start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form, and it was void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." A few interesting starting points, if you will, in this passage. It's interesting that the way the writer describes the current circumstance is exactly the way we see those oceans rising. There's darkness. There's just not darkness around me. We're not like Linus and we have this little bit of cloud of dirt that follows us, or we're like, what's the snowman's name in Frozen? Katie? Olaf, yes, she knows it. Who at the end has this cloud of freezing snow and rain over top of him. It's not like, the writer says it's everywhere. And it's not just a darkness that's everywhere. There's a void. How many times have you felt like there's been a void? And it's into this moment where the writer gives us a glimpse into something. In this void, in this darkness, however we want to describe this and however we want to imagine this, what we start to see is God is hovering. When I think of hovering, I think of those little hoverboards in Back to the Future, right? You know what I'm talking about? They all said that by this time we'd be in flying cars and living on the moon and underwater, but I'm not sure when that's going to happen. But the hoverboards I like. But there's also some connotation of this. This is not like you're levitating above the ground or whatnot. Have you ever had someone just hover around you? Have you ever had someone you just feel the breath on the back of your neck? And even if you don't feel their breath on the back of them, you know they are there, don't you? Because they're hovering. They're right there. In this, right from the beginning, in the first couple verses, the writer gives us the stage to a characteristic of God interacting with history at a starting point. Darkness, void. God hovering. And then God said, "Let there be light." Let there be light. See, when God interacts, when God gets involved, we get a glimpse of something bigger than the voids, than the darkness. And even if we don't feel the Spirit of God hovering, God interacts, steps in, and says, "Let there be light." I love what the psalmist says. "Even my darkness is not darkness to you, O God." Even those things that I call dark and void, they're not darkness. There is no darkness. It is a presence of light. God steps in and interacts, and we get a glimpse of something bigger than us. The problem is, though, is that sometimes we don't see God's interactions as a glimpse of goodness, of grace, and love. We look at certain circumstances, we look at situations, we look at the oceans, and they just look like problems. Darkness, void. Even though God has said, "Let there be light," there is this void. Let me illustrate it this way. Today, United Methodist ministers over the South Georgia Conference are traveling over to the ocean, where the East Coast, is that the East? Yeah, right. Yes, St. Simon's Island, over in that area, for a few days of conference and legislations and things like that. And Katie, hi Katie. Hi, okay. She painted me a picture. I went to the store last night to pick up some dog food and you know, kind of take care of a few things. And I came back, and John was sitting there watching the hockey game, and I was like pulling teeth getting him to watch hockey, but he did. And first thing he said to me is, "Katie painted you a picture." Oh, if you can't see that, here it is. You see that? What in the world is this? Oh, I see her handprints. Beautiful job. Katie, did you draw this? Paint this? Yeah, she had paint all over her hands. Luckily, she didn't have it over the walls. She kept it on the paper. And this is what she gave to me last night. What do you see? Here's the point. It doesn't matter what I see. It's what Katie saw. It's what she sees in this picture that's important to me. I mean, I know she didn't do this out of anger, hatred. She didn't do it out of retribution. It was an expression of her love. And even though I don't understand what it is, I pray that I could get a glimpse of what she saw in this picture. Do you see where I'm going with this? Do you see how important it is sometimes to just get a glimpse of what God is doing? Look, all through our lives, what we want more than anything else is everybody to see things the way we see things. We want people to see it from our perspective. If they would see things from our own perspective, they would understand. Conversation after conversation between husbands and wives, between children and parents, between brothers and sisters or other siblings, what we start to see is these words: "You don't understand. If you could just let me explain, if you could just get a glimpse of the way I see this, you will understand. Let me tell you the way it is, the way I'm seeing this." And what we want is just people to see things from our own perspective. And these become for us problems because they invite us into a place where we are only able to see what we want. And it's easy to see when other people are doing this. You just don't want to see it from my perspective. You just don't understand. And it's hard to recognize when we are doing this ourselves, when we are using those words. And how many times have you said that to your husband or wife? Your boyfriend or your girlfriend? Students, I know it's summertime, but when was the last time you used those words to a teacher? You don't understand why my dog ate this homework. You don't understand. When was the last time you said that to a parent? You don't understand. It's tough and difficult to see when we are doing this ourselves. And sometimes a glimpse is what we need most. Sometimes a glimpse into what other people are seeing is what we need most. And many times it is important for us to see and get a glimpse to see what God sees. See, are you willing to see what God sees? In 1920, Johns Hopkins University did a study, a sociology study. What they did is they took 200 students in high school, or junior high rather, and they in the Baltimore area, and they wanted to watch these kids over the next 20 years. And so they chose these children who, by all society's standards, would not turn out well. They would find themselves in the dregs of society. And after 25 years, the study was concluded with this interview, and surprisingly, out of the 200 students interviewed, only 2 of the students were incarcerated, found themselves as they predicted. And as these men and women, these students, now adults, were interviewed over and over and over again, came up the name of their teacher, Aunt Hannah. That's what they called her, Aunt Hannah. And this came up. And Aunt Hannah, the sociologists were correct in the way that these students would have lived into what society had determined as their goal, as their end. But there was this intervention that Aunt Hannah, a junior high school teacher made, who loved them. And the moral of this story is this: because Hannah intervened, these children did not have to live in a planned out future. They did not have to live in this predicted future. She intervened. The children would almost have certainly lived up to that study's prediction. But all of this was changed. They were headed for the dregs and problems, but Hannah showed them love. But Hannah showed them grace. But Hannah intervened. You see, what's interesting is that the sociologists got a glimpse and saw something different than what they expected. They never predicted that this would happen. They never saw this catalyst called Hannah in their lives. You could say Susie, Joey, Sammy would have ended up as we predicted. But Hannah intervened. But Hannah stepped in. You see what's the fascinating part of this story? Hannah's students, they did not have to accept what Hannah saw in them. They did not have to accept Hannah's interventions of love and grace and mercy. And if they didn't, they would have undoubtedly lived up to the sociologists' predictions? Are you willing to see what God sees? Because our lives are plagued with interventions and interruptions, things that make us stop timing, that in small delays in our schedules, parents intervening for their children, even traffic lights that stop us at moments so we don't get hurt. And what happens if we don't see clearly? What happens when we don't get a glimpse? What happens when we do not stop and see what God sees and get a glimpse of His presence? On a personal level, if we're honest with ourselves, we can probably list several people in our lives that have intervened, who we could say in one way or another, they have stepped in. We were headed this way, but by their grace and their mercy and their intention, they stepped into our darkness, our void, our emptiness. In a broader scale, the same thing can be said about God and humanity. Without God intervening, interrupting this physical world, which starts in Genesis 1, without God giving us His story and His interactions with our narrative, our world would almost certainly have fallen apart. But God intervened. In other words, you could say it like this: apart from God, there is no future. There is no future. You see, we wouldn't be the people that were predicted, those students predicted in the study at Johns Hopkins. They thought of physical prisons. They thought of physical boundaries that these children, these students would have lived into, they predicted. But we live in prisons too. Not out of cement, but certainly a prison nonetheless. Darkness, oceans, void. It's constructed out of materialism. It's constructed out of this doubt. It's constructed out of fear, low self-esteem. And God interacts with our heritage, our narrative, just so that He can give us a glimpse. And sometimes just a glimpse of God is what we need most. Just to see what God sees, just as I desire to see how Katie saw that picture, that painting. Just to see what God sees is what we need most. This phrase where God interacts, this "but God," when God interacts with our narrative, it's throughout the scriptures. You could go into the Old Testament and New Testament. You could look in Genesis 8:1. Noah is in the ark, and they have been with these smelly animals for so long. And the scripture says, while in the ark, God remembered Noah. When Joseph was sold into slavery, and at the end of Genesis in chapter 50, his brothers come and finally they realize who each other is. And Joseph says, you intended this for evil. You expected this to be darkness, a void. But God intended it for good. When the Jews were going through the wilderness, it says, but God led the people around the wilderness towards the Red Sea, towards Mount Sinai. But God, leaving captivity, things of familiarity, things the Israelites had accepted as a norm in their lives. Work harder, slavery, bondage, a prison cell, if you will. And as they left there, it seemed that their darkest days were still before them, and God, the scripture says, but God led them. And the religious leaders, when there was a time when the religious leaders thought Jesus was dead, Peter goes to the same men who convicted Jesus to die and said, "You killed Jesus, but God raised him from the dead." And then Paul in Ephesians chapter 2 says, "You were dead in your trespasses. You were dead in this place where you were enveloped with a void and a darkness and an ocean and the waves, and you were in this place, but God made you alive, resurrected you, transformed you from a child of Adam to a child of Christ." Just a glimpse of God. Sometimes what we need most in our lives. See, what if God did just stand on the sidelines? What if God just stood on the sidelines and watched? And what we start to see is the more that we accomplish, the more that we accumulate, the more that we struggle, the more we realize we never really have enough. Because in our eyes, we have is a glimpse of our own world and our own lives. And what we need to be reminded of is that ordinary things in our lives can give us a glimpse of how God sees things. There's an abundance of mercy and love and grace. You will never exhaust God's mercy, grace, and love in your life. You may find yourself always thinking you need just to get over the next hurdle. But what God promises the most over and over in Scripture is, "Let me worry about tomorrow." He said that to the Israelites in Exodus 14:14. Jesus said it several times through the Gospels. Just worry about right now. Just give your heart now to Christ. Just pick up your cross now. Don't worry about tomorrow. Let me hover over tomorrow. There's a story about a poor woman who lived in the slums of London, and she was invited to go on a holiday, on a vacation with a group of people to the ocean. She'd never seen the ocean before, and when she saw it for the first time, she burst into tears. They looked at her as crazy. "Why are you crying?" they asked her. She pointed to the ocean. And she said, "This is the only thing I have ever seen that there was enough of." So inwardly focused was this woman that never realized that what she needed was a glimpse, an illustration, a metaphor to be able to see and realize that even in our moments of shackles and prisons, there is a God who gives enough. This is the message of Scripture. The people who are accounted in this book, their lives, they're not recorded for us because they were perfect, because they were giants of the faith. I mean, many of them made the dumbest choices in the world. All of those who found themselves in prisons, they were self-made prisons, shackles. But what this Scripture tells us is that these people's lives are recorded, not necessarily to tell what they did, but how God interacted with their narratives. To get us to a point where they never regretted trusting God. You see, when God interacts, we get a glimpse of something bigger. When God interacts, we get a glimpse of something bigger. Lisa, this is probably crazy, but Lisa told me 20 some odd years ago when we were dating. Oh, by the way, we're still dating. That every time she sees a yellow butterfly, it just reminds her that God is there with her. So, man, that's crazy. That's foolish talk, right? A yellow butterfly? What's so special about a yellow butterfly, of all things? I started noticing when those yellow butterflies appear in my life. Those little things that just give me a glimpse, a reminder, ordinary thing that gives me a reminder that God is there. Just to encourage me to stop for a second, right? In the void, in the darkness, and even for a moment, to use that butterfly as a catalyst to recognize the Spirit of God hovering. That God is interacting. To give myself a glimpse. Because just as much as I want people to see from my perspective, how much more does God want you and myself also to see from His perspective? So what is this? This right here can be anything you want it to be. But for me, it is an expression of love for my daughter. That's what it is to me. You might see a tree. You might see a giraffe. I see love. In the chaos of hands and purple paint, I see what Katie saw. At least that is what I choose to see. One of the greatest passages of Scripture is Romans 5:8. The writer Paul starts to unfold our place in this thing called our sinful nature. Our own oceans, darkness. And he said, but God demonstrated His love in this way. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Maybe the cross looks like this to you. Maybe the cross is foolishness. Maybe you ask more questions about what God is doing than just stopping and seeing for a moment and getting a glimpse of what God sees. We celebrate communion. This right here is ordinary bread and its juice. I think we got it from Piggly Wiggly. Maybe Publix, I don't know. But right here, this is ordinary, off the shelf. Bread and juice. Is that what you see? Is that what you're tempted to see when we think of what Christ did for us? Because that's not what God sees. This here is another means of grace, where God uses ordinary butterflies, bread, juice, and paintings to remind us that he steps into our narrative just to give us a glimpse of his grace, because he did not have to. That is what we celebrate today. So don't let this be juice. And don't let this just be bread. May it become a yellow butterfly for you. May it become God saying, let there be light. Certainly let it become a but God moment where you stop and just get a glimpse and see things from God's perspective.